They've been down there too long. I keep telling them that they just need to come upstairs, to leave that cramped, dark room of packed dirt and come into the light. We all need to leave this place while we still can. I'm still clinging to the hope that it's not already too late. Did you know that in Connecticut, settlers aren't required to disclose that a death occurred in a home unless you submit an inquiry in writing? I, sure as heck, wasn't aware, not until we'd already moved in, until it was already too late. I wonder if whoever buys this place after we're gone will think to ask. I did later learn that the realtor regretted selling to us, that if he had known our situation, he never would have shown us the place. I can't help but imagine what our lives would have been like if we'd never bought the small fixer-upper off of Lakeshore Drive. That's all moot now, of course. If it weren't for the price, we'd never have looked at it in the first place, especially since it'd been a foreclosure. I hated the feeling of building our lives on the shattered remains of someone else's, but Gideon and I needed a move. We had to. We couldn't stay in our old house, its recently vacated bedroom dangerously close to becoming a shrine. We couldn't keep going to the same grocery store in our tiny town where everyone knew and regarded us with looks of pity. Once we moved to Bridgeport, we were just 2 more people amongst 100,000. We could mourn in peace and anonymity, lost in the throngs. The living in the city doesn't come cheap, but that's why Gideon and I were looking at a fixer-upper that had sat vacant before the bank eventually reclaimed it. I should have trusted my gut when I thought something about the place was off. The new cheery welcome mat seemed at odds with the rest of the house, which gave off an aura of a deep, almost crushing sadness. It hit me like a wave when we first walked in, a split second before the scent of rot and decay followed in its wake. The realtor apologized and said that they'd found fridges full of rotten food from when the prior owners left the place abandoned. He assured us that he'd dealt with something similar before, and with a few windows left open, it'd air out in no time. The house was outdated in parts, yet remodeled beautifully in others. It seemed the prior owners had apparently begun the process of painstakingly restoring it before they abandoned the place, leaving behind a new kitchen, but upstairs bedrooms that were missing flooring and plastered with faded, mildewy wallpaper. As we approached the door to the basement, the smell intensified to eye-watering levels. There was something else that gave me pause too, something about the basement. The space was cramped, all unfinished dirt floor and exposed brick beyond the small area that had been set up for a washer and dryer. Right at the edge of where the faint light from the single-pole string lamp faded was a small wooden ladder leading down into a darkness that soon swallowed it up. Despite the realtor's best attempts at leading us away from it, I found myself subconsciously drawn to it, unaware I'd even approached until I was standing at the edge.
"What's down there?"
I felt the wave of sorrow and longing the closer I got to the packed dirt floor leading down to the blackness. "There's nobody." For a brief moment, his salesman's smile slipped off of his face, and after an awkward silence, he quickly added, "Just a crawl space." The smile was back. "Just a little extra storage space." As my husband and I stared at the dark expanse beyond the ladder, we discussed plans to install some lighting to make that space, that took up the majority of the basement, usable. We planned a lot of things back then. We wanted to place Bree's belongings in one of the bedrooms like we had at our old home, even though part of us knew that their presence only served to highlight her absence. But the rooms upstairs were a mess, riddled with holes through the subfloors, mold behind the walls, so we reluctantly agreed we needed to complete the renovations before the space would be usable. It didn't feel right to put Bree's things in a storage unit during that time, though. Yes, I knew they were exactly that, just things, just objects, but no matter how many times I told myself that, it felt like we'd be leaving her in a storage locker. So we wrapped up the rocking chair I'd read to her in cellophane, lovingly packed the stuffed animals and Barbies, and with the rest of the house being in the state that it was, we tucked them neatly into the only place safe from construction, the crawl space. Close by and protected while we made a safe, more permanent place for them. At first, I expected us to spend all of our free time down there, like we used to in her room at our old house, but something about the place alarmed me as much as it called to me. I think that even before we'd finished placing her belongings down there, we realized that we'd made a mistake. Some part of me knew, maybe it was the look of that place, the black dirt that seemed to swallow up any light we directed at from headlamps and flashlight beams, or the overpowering smell of lingering rot mixed with old earth. Maybe it was that feeling. The one of emptiness I'd felt when we first moved in had been replaced by something far worse. As we placed the final box, the stale air down there was thick with a sinister sort of excitement. Even then, I had a vague feeling of no longer being alone. It didn't take long for the noises to start. I was running a load of laundry when I heard it over the rumble of the machine, a prolonged shriek. The sound of something sharp being slowly dragged across cellophane. It was my first time alone in the basement, and to hear that emerging from the claustrophobic space, at first I thought it was Gideon down there, opening the rocking chair, and I smiled sadly at the thought of him leaving work early, succumbing to the need to feel close to her again. I too had felt the burning desire to go down there, despite myself.
Couldn't resist?
I called down to the space. The sound abruptly stopped, and I heard shuffling along the hard dirt. I put a foot on the old wooden ladder, figured I'd join him so he wouldn't be alone. It felt right, going down into the darkness. No one should have to be alone, especially in a place like that. That's when I heard footsteps from upstairs, followed by Gideon's voice, announcing his arrival home from work. I sprinted up the basement steps out of breath and nearly tripping as the only thing running through my mind was that if Gideon was upstairs, who the hell was in the crawl space? As I was about to describe what I'd heard to Gideon, I suddenly felt silly. I was in a new place with our past wounds still so fresh. Of course, I was imagining things. The next morning, I was working from home when I heard it echo through the previously silent house. A giggle. A familiar sounding one, coming from outside the kitchen window. I didn't remember leaving the window open, but when I went in to check, it was closed. Still, the laughter continued. That's when I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below, floating up through the grate under the stove. It went on like that every so often. The sound of her soft laughter would float up from the basement, but there was a wrongness to it. It was laughter in name only, hollow and joyless, lacking the light my daughter had always carried. Gideon never mentioned hearing it, so I never brought it up. At the time, I thought maybe I was just losing it due to stress, the stress of losing Bree, of starting over in a new city. Looking back now and recalling the circles under my husband's eyes, the grimness there, he must have been in the same boat. The first time she spoke to me, I'd been bringing down a box of Christmas decorations.
Mom?
I nearly choked on the air I'd been breathing. I never thought I'd hear Bree's voice again. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamt it.
Are you coming?
The voice, song-like, floated up from the dark. In the crawl space, a dry little cough echoed out. I lost my shit. I ran upstairs and I finally told Gideon. My husband gave me a look when I did, a look that said he understood, and if what I needed from him in that moment was to go into the basement and duck into that dark little crawl space so he could tell me everything was okay, then he was going to do it. The little room was pitch black as I followed him into it. All of our attempts to install lighting down there, temporary and otherwise, had failed, and the dim glow from the single bulb in the basement was swallowed up before even descending the ladder. We clicked on our flashlights. I wondered if he too had heard the sound of something moving across the packed dirt that echoed out seconds before we directed our beam towards the darkness. The sound of scurrying. Gideon gasped, and a moment later turned to reveal what he'd seen. A blanket had been placed across the hard dirt, one of Bree's, adorned with smiling characters from her favorite animated movie. Stuffed toys were strewn along it. A single book lay open off to the side. I didn't even need to see the impression left on the blanket to know that someone had been sleeping down there. Gideon shot me a questioning look.
I didn't open the boxes.
I whispered. He stared into the empty space for a long time before he nodded absent-mindedly, insisted we leave the house, called the police to seek out whoever had been living in our home. It was a long night. We gave statements to one officer as the other searched the home. I don't know what was worse. When the first officer said there was no evidence anyone else had entered the house, or when the second officer stayed back to speak to me in hushed tones. You've lost someone. I nodded in surprise, even though it was a statement and not a question. He leaned in. Whatever you think you hear down there, it isn't real. Nothing good could come from a place like that.
You've been in the crawl space?
I got called to do a wellness check on the Mikowskis, and he stared off into space for a long moment before he quickly shook his head, as if trying to escape from his own thoughts. Well, I found them. They were down there. The Mikowskis. It took me a moment to place the name as that of the prior owners. I'd seen the name on some mail we still received for them and brought back to the post office.
What were they doing down there?
I asked, even though the look on his face had me questioning if I truly wanted to know the answer. They weren't in a position to tell me. He stared past me, towards the house. There wasn't enough left of them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I dreamt of the prior owners who never left this place. I dreamt of Bree. I dreamt of the crawl space. I awoke to the feeling of eyes on me. Gideon was sitting up in bed, giving me a concern-laden stare. We need to talk about last night. I don't think you should go into that basement by yourself. My response was silence, confusion. You don't remember what you said to me? He whispered, as if he thought someone else could be listening. I shook my head. That you wanted to go down there to be with her, that... He choked back a sob. You didn't want her to be alone in the dark. My horrified expression seemed to mirror his own. You know she's not down there, Nettie. She never was. I knew that. Rationally I did.
Then what is down there?
I've never seen my husband look more afraid than when he softly said, I don't know. The longer I stayed away from the basement, the louder her laughter got, the more persistent the bleating whispers. When the hushed pleas turned to crying, God, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go see her.
Are you coming?
The weak voice interjected between racked sobs. I found myself drawn to the sound, parental instinct still there, a mental phantom limb. I knew I made the right decision as I descended. Well, until I looked at her. Eyes glinted up at me from the well of blackness beyond, and the sobbing ceased instantly, like someone had flipped a switch.
No, baby.
My mouth was dry as the rational part of me desperately screamed at the rest of me, reminding me that I was not talking to my daughter.
I can't.
I fumbled for my phone for the light, half expecting to see her staring up at me, big brown eyes wide, half afraid of what I'd see. As light flooded the room, I heard a soft movement, something wet sliding across the packed dirt of the ceiling. But I saw nothing. The little storage room was empty. As soon as the light went off, though, those eyes were back, regarding me from higher up along the wall, moving steadily downwards, never once blinking or darting away from my own.
Please?
Her voice repeated. My stomach dropped as I felt a chill at my proximity to the thing mimicking my daughter's voice, something I'd apparently just caught in the act of crawling down the wall.
I don't like the dark,
she croaked out. That's what broke me. That's what led to my husband finding me broken down, bawling at the kitchen table. I begged him not to go back down, but he insisted. This was our home, he'd said. If we couldn't feel safe here, then where could we? So we went down into the basement, me with my phone light and him with the emergency flashlight. It was bold of me to assume that the situation couldn't possibly get worse. By the time I'd descended the little ladder, he'd already walked into the room. He had his back to me, standing in the shadows.
Gideon, where's your flashlight?
I turned it off. She doesn't look like I remember. He whispered, Annette. He added slowly, never turning to look at me, his broad frame blocking whatever he was saying from my flashlight beam. Can you please go upstairs? Pack a bag for us.
But...
No, please. He begged, his voice calm in tone but shaky in delivery. He told me to leave without him if he didn't come back up within 10 minutes, to leave the house if he didn't come out of that basement, and to never come back. Call movers to get our things. I nodded, numb. So, I waited. I waited 10 minutes. After an hour passed, I went down to the basement and the ladder was gone. He must have pulled it down to keep me from coming after him. I felt a wave of unease, but infinitely worse, a sick pang of jealousy. Jealousy that he was down there and I wasn't. I whispered Gideon's name into the dark. Why haven't you left yet? His voice was weak, heavy with desperation.
Babe, it's time to go.
I replied as firmly as I could.
We need to leave, all of us.
Gideon's voice was choked, muffled. No, Nettie, it's too late for me. A day has passed since then. I'm still here. I can't force myself to leave. How do I get them to come out? I just want us to be a family again. This morning when I went down to check on them, the only response that emerged from the crawl space sounded like a low, wet gurgle. They've been silent ever since. I called the police, but they didn't seem to think that my husband and daughter refusing to leave the basement constituted an emergency. I know Gideon told me to leave, but I can't just leave my family. Him and Bree, down there in the dark. I'm out of ideas. We need to be together, the three of us. Please help me. If I can't figure something out soon, if I still can't get them to come to me, well, there's only one option left. And scene, a shorter one, but very, very creepy. Yeah, definitely disturbing. Sometimes, there's squeaky pipes in your house or something. I don't know, you're trying to sleep or something and you hear noises. Ever since I was a kid, that stuff has always freaked me out. That has always been awful for me. I don't like hearing noises in the place that I am living at any point in time, especially if no one else is there. It is horrendous. It is not a good time. It is very scary. If I heard scuttling when I went down to a dark basement, I would... Big no. Anyhow, I hope you all enjoyed the story, and yeah, I will see you in the next one. Ego Volt Anima Vestra.